Hello and welcome to everyone joining us for today's session on young workers in the post-COVID economy trying to recover. We are so deep into COVID that it can seem like there may be no end in sight, but an end will come. And the question we will be exploring today is, what does the post-COVID world of work and post-COVID economy hold for young workers and students? I can assure everyone we have a lively, informative session coming up for the next hour. We'll go straight to the top of the clock and then end at that point. For beginnings, let me introduce myself. I'm Meyer Semiatiki, and I head up the Ryerson Faculty of Arts Young Workers' Rights Hub. I know that many of you are joining us with a connection to Ryerson. You may be students, you may be staff and faculty. Some of you are joining us from beyond, from other universities, other workplaces, other locales. It would be helpful for us as a hub to have an idea of who our audience is, so and a chance to hear you say hi. So while I go on with the inevitable introductions that need to take place, if any of you would like to self-introduce and tell us, are you from Ryerson or external to Ryerson, and what position you're in? Are you a student or in another role? That would be very helpful for us. But again, a warm welcome to everyone. And we are momentarily about to begin. But first, let me say a little bit about the hub and a little bit more about today's session. The mission of the Young Workers' Rights Hub at Ryerson is to promote student and young workers' well-being at work. Specifically, we aim to advance young workers' understanding of employment trends, and you will certainly get that from today's session, but we also want to promote an understanding of young workers' rights on the job and how to exercise and advance those rights. Today's session will enrich our understanding of some pretty big changes impacting our economy and what employment and careers could look like post-COVID. Our speaker, Jim Stanford, is one of the country's leading authorities on the future of work. But before I introduce Jim, and many of you with us may already be familiar with Jim through his writing, through his extensive media profile. Before I take a stab at introducing Jim, let me first make an acknowledgement related to land and responsibility. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. As non-Indigenous peoples, we have held on to that one spoon for too long. We recognize our responsibility to advance justice for Indigenous nations and peoples. So now let me introduce Jim Stanford. He is one of Canada's leading authorities on the future of work. He is an economist and director of the Centre for Future Work, which is a think tank that explores how work is changing in the modern economy. Before that, Jim Stanford was economist and policy director for Canada's largest private sector union, Unifor. And for over 3 decades, Jim has been a popular media commentator, explaining to Canadians what's happening in our economy and what should be happening in our economy. As you'll soon hear, Jim Stanford has a rare gift of speaking economics in English, incomprehensible. English. So Jim Stanford, a warm and thankful welcome to you for being available today and leading this discussion. I will say that Jim will speak for around 30 minutes, and we will then go into a question and answer period. If at any point along the way you have questions, please enter them into the chat function. And this event, I should also say, is being recorded. So Jim, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Meyer, thank you so much for that introduction. You know, we had a federal budget yesterday, and there's a motto that finance ministers follow. It is called under promise and over deliver. And I should have talked to you before that warm introduction, because you've just lifted everyone's expectations. It is true, though. Economists do tend to speak a different language, and part of my mission as a, sort of popular educator, if I can say that, is indeed to demystify economics and help people understand that the economy is not about charts and graphs and the ups and downs of the financial markets. The economy is about our lives, and the fact that we all have to drag our sorry butts out of bed on Monday morning and go off and try to do a job and support ourselves and pay the bills and hopefully enjoy life a bit in the meantime. That is economics, and we've all got knowledge, and we've all got a stake, and we've all got the legitimate perspective to jump into economic debates on. So that is part of our mission for us, teaching the economics of real life, as I sometimes call it, rather than the economics of charts and graphs. I want to pay homage, Meyer, to you and your whole team, Dean Sugerman, and all of you for the amazing initiative with the Youth Worker Hub. I just think every university should have one of these, and thank you for doing it, and thank you for recognizing that so many of the students at Ryerson, like any post-secondary education, are also workers, and it behooves the institution to talk about that dual status that students have to juggle, including the risks and challenges and exploitation that they can face in their jobs. So that's an awesome initiative, and I'm very glad to participate in what you're doing. And I would also like to acknowledge I'm coming to you from Vancouver, so I'm speaking from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I want to pay my respects to those communities and their sovereignty. This is obviously an incredibly challenging time in all kinds of ways. And I know that in Ontario in particular, this third wave is just hitting us like a sledgehammer. And of course, the immediate challenge is, how do we stay safe and healthy? How do we support ourselves and our families through this? And then there's a whole other set of challenges about the economy, jobs, and what it's going to look like coming out of this catastrophe and what we can do to fix it. And there is no doubt that young workers have been hit harder than any other group. In fact, from the beginning, I have felt the worst for young workers and what this COVID is going to mean. It is true they are less likely to die from COVID than our elders, so that's a good thing, okay? Although we don't know for sure whether that judgment will continue with these variants and everything. On the other hand, there is no doubt that the economic consequences of this pandemic and everything that it's brought are going to be felt first and worst by young people. And the damage is not going to repair itself, even when the pandemic stops and we all have a vaccine in our arms, hopefully, and the vaccines work, hopefully. For young people, the legacy of this terrible period in history is going to carry on. This is the bad news. They call economics the dismal science, and these days it's more dismal than usual. I hate to say, but that is the reality, and we may as well understand what we're up against so that we can argue for and advocate for the sorts of policies and supports that could address this crisis. They also say, Meyer, I should point out as a fair warning to the audience, they say an economist is someone who's good with numbers and didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So, that's like that safe harbor statement you hear from the mutual fund salespeople, anything containing this prospectus is no indication of future performance. Well, that was my safe harbor statement there. We will try to keep it intelligible as much as we can. So I will start sharing some slides here, and I'll run through a bit of a presentation. And Meyer, give me the thumbs up if you see that title slide. Okay, very good. Thank you. How do we change work for good after COVID? Thinking particularly about the impacts on young workers and how to repair the damage. Now, Meyer, I know your last session from the Hub talked about how do young people find work. Okay, and that is a very sort of practical and urgent task. And you know, there's some helpful advice in there for sure. I should point out that's not what I'm going to cover in this. It isn't going to be about how do you personally survive this. I know that the challenge is real for people and the people they support. And I sympathize with that challenge fully. And some of the advice that you got in the last session, those who were involved will be helpful. I'll be talking more about the kind of macro and structural dimensions of the problem that we face, that young workers face, why it is that they've been targeted, literally targeted for a disproportionate share of the damage from the pandemic, and what we can do as a society. Right, you know, every individual is going to be out there trying to survive as well as they can, including finding and keeping work. But what can we do as a society to resolve that bitterly unfair burden that we've placed on young people? At the bottom there is the website for our Center for Future Work. All of our literature is there, open access. Please check it out. And my Twitter handle and the center's Twitter handle at the bottom. You're welcome to join the conversation, including you're welcome to tweet from this presentation. And I will be talking about a paper we did on changing work for good after the pandemic that is on the website. And I will, as soon as I finish the slides, I'll circulate a link to that paper in the chat in case anybody wants to check out the full paper. So the first part of my presentation will be about COVID and how it's impacted the world of work, including, of course, the world of work for young people. We have never experienced an economic conflagration of this sort. It started over a year ago now when the lockdowns first hit and the health officials had to shut down whole parts of the economy, in particular because at that point we didn't quite know what we were dealing with and how it spread. In fact, truth be told, we still don't know, do we? So immediately it was those kind of face-to-face, hands-on industries like retail, hospitality, arts and entertainment, personal services that had to get shut down completely in order to stop contagion. Now, the problem is in the economy, everything is connected to everything else. That's the reality of how our economy works. It's a sophisticated, complicated input-output system where linkages join different sectors, different occupations, different jobs, different regions. So what started out in those sectors soon spread through the rest of the economy. Think of it this way, a retail shop has to close. They're not selling anything anymore. They stop placing orders with the wholesaler stops placing orders with the manufacturers, and so on and so forth. And it ends up being like that old shampoo commercial. You know, you told two people and they told two people and they told two people, and before you know it, the whole economy is in a recession, except this time it's who infects two people, not who tells two people. And so what started out as a kind of supply shock in those hard hit sectors, incidentally, sectors where most young people work, that's part of the problem here, quickly morphed into an economy-wide demand-side recession. And what we now have is a situation where it's not just the health restrictions that are reducing our work and our activity, it's the damage that's been done to spending power, consumer spending, business investment, exports, and other key parts of the economy. So even if we all got the vaccine in our arms tomorrow, and we took it, first of all, and it worked, we still wouldn't snap back to full potential because of those supply chain and demand side interactions. This is a very unique and challenging situation. And what makes it all the more challenging is how unevenly the burden of adjustment to the pandemic has been distributed across society. I think every recession is unfair. Recessions always hit poor people hardest. I've never seen a recession in the history of capitalism where rich people were bankrupted and everyone else did just fine. Okay, so every recession tends to impose greater costs on those who can least afford it. But take that lesson and retype it in all caps, bold font, 48 point to describe this recession. We have never seen a recession that's been so brutally and unforgivingly concentrated on particular groups of society. And that is true, by the way, of the health impacts. Okay, we're gathering data now on how the concentration of COVID infection was much, much higher among poor people, working class families, racialized communities, certain neighborhoods, for all kinds of reasons, not least being the sorts of jobs that those people have to do and their living arrangements, and the correlation with other determinants of their health and welfare. So the health impacts have been very unfair, and the economic impacts have been very unfair as well. The burden of job loss and income loss has been felt very disproportionately for various reasons. Number one was the nature of those sectors where the recession started. Those were low-wage service sectors that had to shut down: retail, hospitality, personal services. Most recessions start in the goods sector of the economy, in resources or construction or manufacturing. Not this one. This one started in service jobs. And moreover, the people who suffered first were people in non-standard work relationships in those service sectors, which is something that we've seen spreading through our economy over the last couple of decades. The shift away from permanent full-time jobs with entitlements like sick pay and severance notices and that kind of thing, towards non-standard jobs, which are very insecure. There, the employer can basically let you go on a just-in-time basis. If they don't need you, you don't work. It's that simple. And so we saw a concentration of job losses in temporary positions, labor hire, part-time jobs, various types of contractors or dependent contractors, or nowadays, of course, gig jobs. These are all positions where the employer treats you as a sort of disposable productive input. And if they need you, you might get a few hours work. If they don't need you, you don't. And that means that the downturn in employment was particularly experienced by workers in insecure jobs. In a way, that's the point of it. That's why insecure jobs were created. So you can say this, you know, they served their function from the point of view of employers who were able to shed labor quickly. But it meant that the harm of the downturn was very painfully concentrated. Then there's, of course, the question of who makes up those groups. And the reality is, because those are unattractive jobs, relatively speaking, the people in them are people who already experienced inequality or marginalization in our labor market. So young people experienced it tremendously. Young people work in those service sectors in non-standard jobs. There aren't many young people out there who've got a permanent full-time job with basic benefits like dental and healthcare and retirement plan. That for a young worker today is like winning the lottery. It used to be the norm, but young workers are the shock troops of the precarious labor market, and therefore they've borne this the brunt of this tidal wave of job loss immediately. Women, of course, also are more likely to be working in those sectors and more likely to be working in non-standard work. And immigrant newcomer communities, racialized workers, also very disproportionately represented in those groups. And then, of course, there's the intersectionality dimension, which is there are people who experience 2 or 3 or more dimensions of those inequalities. So for a young woman of color, there's no doubt that they're getting it from all directions. And the impacts of the COVID pandemic and resulting job losses on targeted groups of Canadians, including young workers, has been brutal and damaging and catastrophic for them. And I think it will be very damaging for our economy, for the strength of our economy, for the cohesion of our economy, for what economists call these days in their highfalutin language, the social capital of our economy. Social capital, to me, is a kind of a nonsense phrase that was invented by conventional economists who can't think of any other word to use to describe solidarity and inclusion and sharing. And the fact that when you have a society that works that way, people trust each other, people can count on each other, and society can get through stuff. And, Canada has some so valuable social capital, and it did help us in the initial stages of the pandemic, but that will be at risk big time if we allow those hard-hit groups, to continue to shoulder without appropriate support such an unfair share of the total burden. So let's look a little bit at some of the hard and rather depressing numbers to describe this crisis. Canada lost 3 million jobs in 2 months between February and April last year, unprecedented. Gradually, we started to claw our way back, ups and downs. By March last month, we had regained 90% of that. That still leaves us 300,000 jobs below where we were, which is still a bad recession. So it's not like we're out of the woods. And I'm now worried, of course, with this third wave that we're probably going to see a downturn in April and May. GDP also declined by 18%. We have never experienced an 18% decline in GDP in Canada. This is absolutely unprecedented. And everybody felt it. By the time the income stops flowing and the spending gets cut back, then workers, families, businesses, universities experienced enormous stress. We've seen this debacle of Laurentian University declaring bankruptcy in Ontario. What a pathetic outcome of not just mismanagement by that university's administration, but a government which is willing to stand by and let a university go bankrupt. Are you insane? This is a vital institution that prepares us in our society. So everybody's experiencing it. We have seen a deeper decline than we did in the 1930s, faster and much larger than we did in the 1930s. The key task now is to make sure it doesn't become the 1930s. We don't end up with a decade-long recession that ends in world war, by the way. Need I remind you? What we have to do is address this powerfully with lessons that we've learned from past mistakes and rebuild as quickly and inclusively as we can. So a couple of charts and graphs, again, to illustrate what we're dealing with. This is the roller coaster that shows the course of employment in the pandemic, that initial sort of stomach churning drop, just like that first drop you go on a real roller coaster. I can almost feel it in the pit of my stomach right there. In the first months, we lost 3 million jobs, gradually rebuilding, a bit of a fading in the second wave around Christmas time, and then rebuilding since. And we're still 300,000 jobs below where we need to be. Now, this is the aggregate picture, but of course, not everyone experienced the average outcome. And this is the problem we face for young workers. So this graph just shows you the dramatically disproportionate impact on employment that was experienced by young workers. The initial decline in those first 2 months, one third of jobs for people in the under 25 age bracket disappeared in those first 2 months. So the proportionate job loss was more than twice as bad. That's a 15% decline for all workers and a 34% decline for young workers. And of course, trying to claw our way back from that for young people, and some progress made. But then look, even in the second wave around Christmas, that decline for young people was much worse than it was for the average for all workers. And again, that reflects that young people are on the front lines of this precarious labor market. As soon as demand disappears or the company faces some uncertainty, young people are the first ones ushered out the door. And the current situation of young workers compared to the overall labor market is significantly worse. If we look at where we are at by March, what share of the jobs from that initial downturn, lost in that initial downturn, so the initial loss of 3 million jobs nationwide, 90% of them have been won back for all workers. But for the young cohort, it's the remaining damage, the remaining ground yet to be covered, even as of March, almost twice as bad. We're almost 20% below the employment levels that we had at the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic. So this just confirms what I'm sure most of your audience, Meyer, experiences from their firsthand knowledge, that they and their friends and fellow students have absolutely been slammed with the worst impacts of this pandemic. And it shows up in the unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate, which is almost twice as high for young workers as it is for the labor market as a whole. So no doubt, for all of those reasons that we mentioned, the concentration in hard-hit sectors and the concentration in non-standard or precarious jobs, the downturn for young people has been particularly destructive. Now, as we're considering the dimensions of the economic downturn, I have to say a few words about this claim that is sometimes out there that somehow there's a trade-off between stopping COVID and protecting the economy. And, you know, we saw this big time with Doug Ford in Ontario, you know, crying crocodile tears about how sad he was to think about having to close down small businesses to protect public health. And we saw it from others like Jason Kenney in Alberta, who kept talking about a balanced approach when he was refusing to impose the health restrictions that that scientific advice obviously indicated. This argument that you're going to save the economy by tolerating COVID was absolutely false, short-sighted, and self-defeating. And the international evidence and the international consensus among economists, by the way, is clearly that the best thing to do for the economy is to stop contagion. And we made some big mistakes in Canada in this regard. Initially, you know, we liked to pat ourselves on the back in Canada for our kinder, gentler approach and the fact that we did better than the Americans, okay? We could give ourselves a national repetitive strain injury, patting ourselves on the back for doing better than the Americans. That isn't saying much, okay? And then because we relaxed and reopened proactively and refused to respond as quickly as we needed to, now we're in the soup again. And in fact, the worst is still ahead of us, which is a horrible thing. And the way that our government response, particularly in Alberta and Ontario, was diffused and distracted by this false concern with protecting the economy. Now our economy is way worse than it would be. And if we looked around the world at other countries, places like Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, Norway, places that cracked down hard and fast and strong on COVID and tried to get as close to zero COVID as possible, they're the ones whose economies have reopened and are going full gangbusters today. So what they did by supposedly protecting the economy actually made matters much worse. And we see this clearly interprovincially in Canada. The provinces that were most successful, including by closing provincial borders to limiting COVID, are the ones, particularly in the Atlantic, that did the best at preserving employment. Alberta did the worst. So Jason Kenney's balanced approach to save jobs instead of just protecting health actually destroyed jobs. And there's an important lesson there about what the economy is. You know, after all, the economy is composed of human beings. So how can the economy be strong if people are getting sick and dying? Obviously not. Internationally, they say that misery loves company, and we've got lots of company because, of course, this has been a global catastrophe, although there's been different responses that have had different effects. This shows the decline in GDP last year on average for the year compared to 2019 across all of the industrial countries in the OECD. And places where COVID ran rampant, like Italy and Spain and Britain, had the worst declines. Places that successfully controlled COVID, like Korea, Norway, have the smallest declines. China is there at the top, the only major industrial country where output actually grew last year, which is ironic considering that's where the pandemic started. But their government obviously had a very strong and powerful health response that limited the contagion very quickly. And as a result, China's economy is doing much, much better than ours. Canada is there right in the middle, almost exactly matching the OECD average with about 5.5% decline. So have we done better than some places? Yes. Could we have done much better if we were smarter and more cohesive and our governments stopped with this nonsense about protecting business? We could have done much, much better. One thing on the numbers, and this is really important for the youth labor market, the official unemployment number is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the damage that's been done. The official unemployment rate in March was 7.5%. That doesn't remotely tell you the full story about who's unemployed and underemployed in the labor market. You have to jump through several hoops in Canada in order to be officially considered unemployed. You can't have worked a single hour. You can't be on the payroll of an employer waiting to be called back. And you have to be actively seeking work, not just watching the ads, but putting in several applications a week. And if you don't fit all of those criteria, you're not considered officially unemployed. So if we count people who are still on the payroll, who aren't looking for work, maybe because the public health officers told them to stay home, or who've lost most of their hours, the true unemployment rate for the economy as a whole will be twice as high, 15%. And do the same math for young people. The official unemployment rate is 14%. But if we count people who've dropped out, aren't looking for work, or have lost most of their hours, it's going to be closer to 30%. This is like a depression for young workers. That is the absolute analogy, and it's valid. Now, what's going to happen in terms of the recovery, and how do we support young people through that recovery? A debate amongst economists that has kind of been dumbed down into a debate over letters of the alphabet. This is, I find, kind of amusing because economists like to brag about how complicated and mathematical their models are. And here we are debating about different letters of the alphabet. A V recovery means you snap back immediately to where you were once the health restrictions are lifted. A U recovery means it might take a little while, but they're still optimistic that you'll get there all on its own. The pessimists thought an L shape, where we'd actually get stuck at the very low level of employment. That was too pessimistic, even for me. Clearly, we were going to get some recovery, and we already have. The K-shaped theory says that there's a divergence in society. Some people will recover, and other groups will continue to decline. There's an element of truth to that, but I don't think it quite tells the whole story. My view can't be summed up by a letter of the alphabet, at least not a letter of the English alphabet. Here's how I would draw the likely recovery, where you got this major downturn, you get a partial recovery, and we've seen that already. You know, as I mentioned, we're back to 80–90% of where we were, but you never get back to your full potential. You kind of bounce along for a while, depending on what happens with more outbreaks, more variants, also depending on how consumers and businesses respond and when they start spending again. And my judgment is we'll never get back to full potential unless we've got a deliberate national plan to get back to full potential. If we just assume that once things reopen, everything will recover, we're going to be setting ourselves up for years of recession or even depression. So the problem is, this isn't a letter in the alphabet. What do you call this? Some people say if you turn your head sideways, it looks like a corkscrew. Okay, a corkscrew lying there with a kind of a fancy Art Nouveau, Art Deco handle there. You know, that would be actually quite a good product. Someone on social media suggested, no, it looks like the Loch Ness Monster. Look at this. There's the Loch Ness Monster with its head coming down into the water, then bouncing back down. You see, and that looks exactly like the model that I just portrayed. So I have patented the term Loch Ness Monster recovery, and this is what I think is we're in for. And I expect to win the Nobel Prize in economics for it someday. We'll see. And the lesson is, the serious part of this is that we're not going to have an automatic rebound. We're going to need a plan to get there, and a plan that has to recognize the damage that's been done to young people in particular, and emphasize improving their prospects as part of the recovery. Now, the challenge is not just to improve the quantity of work, we also have to improve the quality of work. And this is the purpose of some of our research on how do we change work for good after COVID, for good in both senses of the word, for better, but also permanently, okay? And the reality is that the pandemic exposed some very serious fractures in how our labor market was working long before we'd ever heard of coronavirus, and showed that some of those problems had to be fixed. And if we want to reopen and stay reopen, and we want to repair the damage, especially that has been caused in targeted communities, young people, women, racialized workers, and others, we're going to have to repair that damage. We're going to have to take some serious measures to strengthen and improve our labor market going forward. And our research identified 10 different ways that we said work must change for good after the pandemic. And I don't have time to go through all 10 of them. I'll circulate the link, as I mentioned, as soon as I finish the slides, that you can check it out. I will give you a little taster here, okay? I'll give you a little taster. I'll cover four of these 10 very quickly. The issue of space in workplaces, the issue of working from home, which is going to be a big deal going forward, the problems of precarious work and how it's contributed to the disaster of the pandemic. And then the last one, how do we give workers more say and more voice, more agency in workplaces in order to bring about those other required changes. So I'm going to give you four, a little taste of four. I think of this like, you know, when you go to the pub and they got like 50 beers on tap and you can never figure out which one to order. And so you can ask for a flight, right? Have you ever tried that? A flight where they bring you a little tray with four cute little glasses of different beers on it. I love to do that. And I'll give you a flight of four with the quickly summarizing four of these. The first one was space. Workplaces have been an important source of contagion, and how dangerous a workplace is depends on how closely you work with others, your colleagues or your customers or your clients, if you're in a caring role. And the reality is employers in our economy like to cram workers in because it saves money. So if a Tim Hortons franchisee can put 12 people into a 100 square foot kitchen and have them dodge each other all day with hot beverages, they'll do it. And lo and behold, that's a good way to catch COVID, even if you haven't caught it from your customers. Same goes for meatpacking plants, okay? The employers figure out that if they just put everyone standing shoulder to shoulder all day long on the assembly line, that's cheaper than giving them more space. And lo and behold, that's a horrible way to catch COVID as well. So coming out of this, not just to address COVID, but to address the next pandemic and to address the general issues of health and safety and dignity in workplaces, we have to reorganize space. We have to have a reconfiguration of spatial relationships in workplaces, and it's going to be expensive. And employers have to be pushed to do it. And the people who will benefit the most are the generally low-income people doing those jobs. So we did some research to correlate who works closely with other people in their jobs. You can actually get data on that and correlate that with incomes. And you'll see jobs like nursing aides and carers, people in food manufacturing, waiters, retail cashiers. Those are people who work very closely with others, whose jobs are generally low paid, but who had a very high risk of catching COVID, and who face other health and safety challenges from that undue crowding in workplaces. The CEO doesn't have this problem. The CEO has power to negotiate multi-million-dollar compensation, but also negotiate a big fat corner office with windows and a door that closes. So they're not worried about catching COVID at work, on top of the fact that they can generally do their work from home anyway. So this is a fundamental inequality in our labor market that we have to address. The second of these taster glasses I'll put out for you, working from home. Big surge in home work during the pandemic, and that's been helpful for those who can take their jobs home. It's allowed them to keep earning money and avoid the risk of infection from going to work and taking the bus and everything else. Remember, not everyone can do that. Maybe a third of workers can do that. So we shouldn't view working from home as a silver bullet. And it is people in those face-to-face industries who are still confronting the risk of contagion. There's lots of issues to be confronted because I think work from home will stay more popular in the future. People who can do it like to do it, and they're going to want to keep doing it. And to some extent, employers are going to have to respond to that desire and at least allow partial working from home arrangements. The number of people in Canada working from home soared during the pandemic, over 5 million people doing it right now. And that's over a quarter of all employment. And it will stay elevated. It won't stay that high, but it will stay far above where it was before the pandemic. There's lots of issues for us to think about in terms of how we make work from home sustainable and safe and fair. Issues like space. Most people don't have a spare room in their house or apartment that they can just put over to an office. So there's got to be an issue about how do we compensate them for their space, the costs of equipment, a desk, and a proper setup, health and safety issues, including ergonomics. If you think you're going to work for 6 or 7 or 8 hours a day sitting on the couch with the laptop on your knees, you are better start making your appointments with your chiropractor and your physio and your medical team, because that's a disaster waiting to happen. Other safety issues like violence against women at home from home work in family situations that aren't safe. How do we limit employer surveillance of our work while we're at home? It's bad enough at the workplace that they've got GPS and video cameras and keystroke counters to monitor how you work. We do not want the employer's eye in our house. So lots of issues to take on there. The third glass in this flight of tasters, how do we regulate precarious work? The growth of precarious work contributed to the catastrophe in many important ways. One of them is people in insecure or non-standard jobs generally don't have paid sick leave benefits. So that means if they should have stayed at home, they felt an economic compulsion to keep working. That's a menace to public health, not just to them and their colleagues. Same with the problem of multiple job holding. That is a common feature in the precarious labor market, where people put 2 or 3 or 4 jobs together to try and pay their bills. If they get sick, that means they're infecting 2 or 3 or 4 different workplaces. And we saw that happen in long-term care homes with horrible, horrible consequences. And of course, as we talked about at the beginning, precarious jobs explain why young people and women and racialized communities experienced so much more than their share of the job losses. So we have to put some limits on the growth of precarious work. We have to limit the ability of employers to treat workers like a just-in-time input. We have to ensure that all workers, including part-time, temporary jobs and gig workers, have access to basic entitlements like workers' compensation and sick pay. We cannot have a situation where the Ubers of the world can completely run around an end run around basic requirements like minimum wage and workers' comp, just because they think the boss is an app rather than a company. The reality is your boss is still a company, and they're just exploiting a loophole in our laws to deprive workers of those basic rights that are important, not just for them, but for all of us. The data on the concentration of job losses in non-standard positions, very, very clear. 15% decline in overall employment, 34%, as we talked about, for young people, 30% decline in part-time employment, 30% decline in temporary jobs, 22% decline in private sector jobs versus public sector roles, which were more stable. Interesting, you're more than twice as likely to have lost your job in a non-union workplace than in a unionized workplace, because you don't have a contract that covers issues like notice, severance, seniority, layoffs, etc. The employer just gets rid of you. So those are all reasons why we have to limit precarious work with every tool in the toolbox, including unionization and collective bargaining. The last of those 4 taster glasses is the issue of how do workers have a say in their workplaces. And that's going to be required. If we're going to fix any of those other things, including health and safety and getting more space at work and safe practices for homework and limits on precarious work, workers have to have a say. They have to have a collective voice. They have to be able to monitor their workplaces, have the education to know when things are not adequate, including health and safety provisions, and the power to speak up and demand change. And in this regard, I think the pandemic is a clarion call for us to revitalize and strengthen our structures of representation and voice, including unionization, but including other measures as well. And we just published through our Center for Future Work a research paper on the modern manifestations of worker voice and how they would help us recover from COVID. Let me take the last handful of minutes here, Meyer, and talk about how we rebuild after COVID and why young people have to be front and center in that effort. We are in a 3rd wave now. Hopefully there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully it's not the train coming the other way in terms of the variants. Hopefully the vaccines come quickly and work. But again, even if we all had the vaccine tomorrow, we're still in a very deep recession. We're still in the deepest recession that we've had since the 1930s. And unfortunately, given this 3rd wave, it's likely to get worse before it gets better. And this is why, coming back to my Loch Ness Monster theory, I think we need a very aggressive, comprehensive, sustained effort led by government to lead us on a full recovery. If we just sit back and say, we'll wait for consumers to start spending again and wait for businesses to start investing again, it's not going to happen. And we will be stuck in a recession or a depression for years to come. They don't have the confidence, they don't have the ability to act on a national scale, and they don't have the financial resources that government has. So we need government to step in with a very powerful, sustained reconstruction plan to get the ball rolling again at the macroeconomic level and to produce more and better jobs, especially for young people. There's a very good historical analogy to this when we think about World War II and the incredible challenges that we faced as a country then. Even before the fighting ended, the federal government appointed a Department of Reconstruction and appointed C.D. Howe, one of our most legendary figures in public policy in Canada, to head it up, and already started planning things like St. Lawrence Seaways and Trans-Canada Highways and the expansion of programs like Canada Pension and Medicare, and building modern industries like automotive and aerospace. Here's C.D. Howe in de Havilland factory near Toronto. This is the kind of strategy that we're going to need to lead us into several years of recovery. And there's all kinds of things that need to be done as part of that reconstruction effort that government can and must lead the way on, including obviously physical infrastructure. That's a no-brainer, but also our social and human infrastructure, things like affordable housing, fixing our long-term care homes, which were a catastrophe, childcare, expansion of public services, the energy transition that's been accelerated during the pandemic. We all know now that fossil fuels will never again lead economic growth in Canada, and that renewables are not just cleaner, they're cheaper and more reliable. So this is a time to absolutely move forward quickly with the energy transition and all of the jobs and opportunities that would implement. This is the analog to the post-war reconstruction plan that actually opened up a whole generation of inclusive, expansive growth. And we could do exactly the same thing right now. The childcare issue is a really important one. You probably heard in the federal budget yesterday, the government committed to a 5-year rollout of a national childcare program. Very, very positive development, real money on the table after years and years and years of talking about it. We've done work to show what an enormous boost even that one program would make to Canada's recovery from COVID. 200,000 jobs in early childhood centers, a lot of those for young people graduating from programs like the one at Ryerson. More jobs in the supply chain, because parents can afford good daycare for their kids. More parents, especially women, can join the labor market. You get a giant boost in GDP from all that, and a giant boost in government revenue. You actually will get more revenue flowing into government than it costs to operate the service. So in that regard, it's a no-brainer. And there's lots of other ways that government could contribute to the recovery. And we have to put the challenges of young workers front and center in that reconstruction plan. So again, they were hit more than twice as hard than the average in the labor market. A third of their jobs disappeared and 20% of their jobs are still missing. They're the last hired and the first fired. And the impacts of that do not end when the recession ends, because young people's careers have been delayed by 1 or 2 or 3 years, or they start out in lower wage positions. That affects their whole working life trajectory in terms of where their incomes go and what they can expect from their job. And how do we solve the crisis of youth unemployment? First, we have to solve the crisis of unemployment writ large. We need an aggregate strategy to reduce unemployment as close as possible to zero. That's what will force employers to start looking around, including at young people, to bring them on. But we also have to have programs that are targeted at young workers, things like training co-ops, work placements that help young people get a foot in the door, a much stronger apprenticeship program. I would like to see the government offer a youth job guarantee, where the government would say, for anyone under 25, if you can't find a job, we'll make you a job in some kind of public service role. You know, we used to have things like Katimavik in Canada and other programs where young people who weren't going to university and didn't have a job could sign up for a position where they'd learn something, possibly learn some skills, and have a great experience, and then work on community projects. That's the sort of thing that makes sense when you've got a chronically recessed labor market. And then we have to target young people with some of the income supports. The CESAB from last year, the student emergency benefit, was very important to help young people through I don't know why we don't have a CESIV this year. We should still have the CESIV. We actually need it again. And we need other income supports going to young people. Lots of questions, from sort of some of the usual suspects about how we're going to pay for this because of the deficits. The deficits are large, there's no doubt about it, which is simply a sign that government did what it was supposed to. Government mobilized huge resources to support Canadians and help us through this terrible catastrophe. And again, the historical analogy, our debt was huge at the end of World War II. Not one person that said, well, we can't fight the Nazis because the deficit's too big. Okay, we had to do it and we did do it. And then when the war was over, we spent more money. We didn't go into austerity. We spent more money to finance that reconstruction effort. And we have to do that again this time. And because interest rates are so low and the Bank of Canada is helping, this is absolutely not an issue. There are things to lose sleep over these days. The deficit is not one of them. So Myra, let me wrap up. Thank you and the team and all your participants for your attention. I think there is a silver lining to this terrible moment. And I don't say that lightly because it can be sort of patronizing to say, well, it's a challenge, but whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Okay, I'm not into that. But I do see ways in which our mindset has changed because of the COVID. Canadians recognize that government must play a very important supportive role. And there's very few people who say government is too big, right? We were glad that government was big and could mobilize $350 billion in deficit financing to protect people through the crisis. We've also recognized that we can't get through without the bread and butter jobs that people do all the time. And I think we've got a new respect for the jobs and that value, including the jobs that young people do as cashiers in grocery stores and delivering our fast food and cleaning our buildings. These are jobs that have long been devalued, but actually without them, we couldn't have gotten through the pandemic. So let's treat them like the professionals they are. Let's treat them like the essential services they play, not just in healthcare, which is obviously an essential service, but all of those other roles, and give them some stability and some income security and value their job, not just thank them and give them a little tip. So I think there are opportunities to think big about how we rebuild, including how we rebuild with a fair opportunity for young people. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you so much for this powerful, interesting presentation. I know we've all learned a lot and you've inspired and prompted a whole number of questions. I have to say, I think one of my takeaways from your talk is I'm pretty sure I'm Minister of Finance material. That was a good job I did there, under promoting you, underselling you, so that in the end, your presentation, of course, exceeded expectations. Jim, that was superb.
Oh my God! I just looked at the clock, Meyer. Exceeded my time limit.
I know.
I'm so sorry about that.
Now, and Jim,
I'm glad to stay on if people want to. I'm sorry about that.
Jim, I know you have another commitment at the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep you long, but there are a fair number of questions. Jim, ballpark, how much time might you have? And
yeah, I could stay for another 15 minutes if that works at your end, Meyer.
Beautiful, beautiful and perfect. And coordinating the Q&A part of this conversation is our host for this session, Taylor Deasley. Taylor is a fourth-year student of politics and governance at Ryerson. In addition to hosting today, she has done a lot behind the scenes in making today's event possible. Taylor, thank you for that. And Taylor, you now have a pretty tough job of getting a handle on quite a number of questions that have come in and putting them to Jim. So over to you, Taylor.
Great. Yeah, we have a lot of really great questions. So hopefully I'll try to get to all of them, but bear with me. So we'll start with one of the earliest questions. So what is the one most pertinent piece of advice you can offer to young job seekers for the summer and or fall?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't have a magic recipe. It is a brutal world out there in the labor market, particularly for young people. What is ultimately going to help young people is us organizing and mobilizing to demand a full employment and a youth job guarantee. And that's not going to do you much good looking for a job this summer. So all I can say is don't forget that big picture solution that has to come about. And, check in with the employment support office at Ryerson. They've got great services there, and any other leads, and give it your best. But there is no individual solution to this crisis. It will only be a social solution.
And speaking of social solutions, one of the questions was, given the shift to automation and AI and technology replacing jobs recently, do you have any thoughts on what would be a possible solution for that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about automation and technological unemployment, and we've studied this quite a bit in our center. I frankly am not worried about that. There will be some jobs and some occupations that are changed by technology, but the reality is, on an economy-wide basis, there's no evidence that people are being displaced by machines. In fact, if anything, there's evidence that the business sector is not investing very much in new technology, and this is actually a problem. Far from thinking that investment is too high in robots and machinery, in Canada's case, they're not investing enough in new technology, and it's part of the reason that so much of our labor market is now in these relatively low-tech, low-paid jobs in the retail and hospitality sectors and elsewhere. So as long as we support the labor market with an ambitious full employment strategy and support workers with training and adjustment opportunities, I think we can manage the technological dimension of change very effectively. We have done it in the past. We've always confronted technological change and how it changes jobs. What's changed is that we've gotten away from that vision of full employment with high quality, stable jobs, and instead embraced this precarious labor market. And it's the precarity, not the technology, that is the big threat here.
We'll go to the third question. What is your opinion on how remote work and the more shift to people working from home is going to change things post-pandemic?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, there's been a huge increase in working from home. Not everyone can. Maybe a third of people can do their jobs from home. The rest are still having to go out there, so we shouldn't forget that. But I think there will be a permanent increase, not at the current level, but a permanent increase in work from home. That could change things for good, and it could change things for bad. I think there's a mixture of opportunities and risks there. Obviously, for people, it means they can do their job without having to commute. They avoid some of the costs and time of getting to work. In many cases, it allows them to try to better balance their paid work with their family responsibilities, especially if they've got kids. On the other hand, it's damn near impossible to get any work done around the house when kids are there. So, it does allow you to at least be present at work. Whether it allows you to get anything done is another matter. And that's, again, where we still need that early childhood program. There's some risks. Here's one of the big risks I'm worried about. I think employers will recognize that people want to stay home to do their work, and they're going to start cutting wages to offset that fact that people are interested in working from home. And I think we're already starting to see that in some places. Employers will say, I don't think I have to pay you as much because you don't have to pay for the bus. And what's more, you want to do this. So I know you want to do this, so therefore I don't have to pay you as much. And I think we will see employers trying to mobilize this ultra flexible, potentially cheaper source of labor supply to work from home, and in a way that degrades the quality of those jobs. So there are benefits and risks of this trend, and I think we've got to be realistic about both of them. And we got to think about ways we can support people in homework situations to defend the quality and stability of their jobs.
And earlier at the beginning of this session, you had mentioned the federal budget being presented yesterday. Someone had a question about what's your opinion on the recent federal budget and its impacts on young workers, employment prospects, and the economy in general?
Yeah, I think well, first of all, the budget was 700 pages, and I haven't read all 700 yet. I did get a high-level view, but I don't know what's in there particularly for young workers. So this is something that I should have a look at. I think the general direction of the budget is a positive one. The government clearly resisted the calls from some of the predictable conservative voices to cut back spending, to focus on balancing the budget, and so on and so forth. So in that regard, they've said, in a way, kind of what I was arguing, that we need a sustained national reconstruction plan. And they said over the next 3 to 5 years, we're gonna fund some really important measures. The childcare one was kind of the centerpiece of it, but there was significant announcements around energy investments, affordable housing, and some others. So I'd say the general direction is correct. What we'll have to do now is make sure the details are determined and that the programs are rolled out, so that it isn't just kind of a big pre-election kind of announcement, but that it's actually delivers the goods. I think that could be the challenge now, but the direction very positive.
Great, thank you. And then we have another question here, specifically related to precarious jobs. Could you expand on the possibility of precarious workers seeking representation and reasons why there's been barriers in the past?
Right. Oh, that's a really good question, given how this non-standard employment model is spreading. Of course, the gig economy is a very high-profile example of workers who are employed to do a service, but they aren't given any guarantees about hours of work, minimum wage. They aren't given basic safety things like workers' compensation or paid sick leave. And it's all dressed up under this idea that they're not workers, they're small business people. And frankly, there's a technical term in economics for that argument. The term is bullshit, if I can be so bold. Bullshit is a technical term in economics that means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, so there's the full definition. And this idea that an Uber driver or a food delivery rider is not a worker is nonsense. It's just a giant excuse for the employers to avoid some of those basic requirements of employment. So how do we get around that? Well, part of it is advocating for legal changes so that they actually have to live up to those responsibilities. Part of it is organizing among non-standard workers, including gig workers. And it is possible in Canada to do that. It's hard, but it is possible. The Ontario Labour Relations Board has confirmed that gig workers have the right to organize, to unionize, and they should do that. The problem is, like anyone else trying to organize, they're going to face resistance from employers. So the one delivery company that did get unionized then pulled the plug and shut down in Canada out of revenge. So this is the kind of thing where they have to be supported by governments, supported by the rest of the union movement, supported by advocates in standing up to that kind of blackmail. And it's not just gig workers. Gig workers get a lot of the attention because it's sort of novel, but this practice is rife in all kinds of other areas. Think about the security business or the cleaning business. Those are two examples where people, no smartphone, no app, they're just artificially constructed as a contractor, paid some flat rate to go and clean the building no matter how long it takes, and don't get any of the protection and entitlements that a real cleaning worker should get. And by the way, cleaning is an important job. In fact, we've discovered in the pandemic, our lives depend on good cleaning. So let's treat those jobs with the respect and stability that they deserve.
And we've actually gone through all the questions. So we have one last question. It's from a parent of a Ryerson student. They want to know how they can help their child in university access portals and ways to kind of navigate opportunities for summer jobs and internships, and if there's any tips for kind of navigating that process.
Right. Well, again, here I just in a way have to apologize. I am not an employment search expert. I know that there are supports available through Ryerson. I see that Derek has shared the video from the session last week, which covered some of those details. I would suggest checking in with the employment counseling office at Ryerson, seeing what kind of resources are available, and most of all, just standing by your kid. I'm the parent of 2 young adult kids, and I worry like hell about what the future holds for them. And I got no easy answer other than support them and love them and tell them this is not their fault. Okay, this is society's fault. And together, all generations can fight for a better society where every young person has the right to fulfill the incredible potential that they represent.
And we just, there was one last question that just trickled in. As more students are enrolling in university and it's more common now to have a bachelor's degree, someone's asking, is getting only a bachelor's degree going to be enough in the future? And how should they kind of think about that moving forward?
I'm a big believer in education, and the evidence is overwhelming that the more education you get, the better your job prospects are. That's not necessarily because you needed the education to do the job. There is a process of kind of queuing or degree inflation, if you like, whereby when jobs are scarce, employers will choose the people who've got more education, whether they needed that education or not. So there's no doubt that a BA still helps you, absolutely. There's no doubt also that there's a range of ways, not just the sort of pragmatic learn a particular technique type of education. There's a range of ways in which education helps you, including the skills like teamwork, adaptability, communication skills that employers, if they're smart, recognize are very important. The idea that, you know, what you should really do is try and pick one particular technology that you know will be the hot programming language or the hot platform in the future and become an expert on that. Don't try to do that, because the only thing you know is you'll be wrong in terms of picking which technology it rules. We don't know what technology is going to rule in 5 years, let alone 20 years. So learning a broad range of skills, including the skills that you get in an undergraduate arts degree, I think has still tremendous value. I only wish that we organized our society in a way that allowed every graduate to utilize the investment they've made in their skills to the fullest of their potential.
Excellent, thank you. So we got to all the questions. Yep. So I'll hand it over to Meyer to.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And Jim, I'm going to exercise prerogative to ask you one last question. I've been thinking about what you might say we can learn from the experience of the previous organization you worked with for such a long period of time, what was initially the Canadian Auto Workers and then changed its name to Unifor. You know, there was a time when work in the auto industry would have been placed at the worst end of the employment experience continuum in terms of dangers of work, low pay, precarious. Today, of course, work in the auto industry is one of the most desirable jobs that many Canadians would dream of. How did you get from there to here? Like, how did auto workers go from being so vulnerable and well, to put it crudely, such lousy jobs into being in the kind of positions they're now in?
And by good job today, you mean a job with a living wage and a decent pension and basic benefits.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And there's nothing inherent in the auto industry to explain why those jobs are better, and jobs in, say, meatpacking plants are low paid, insecure, and great places to catch COVID. The difference is, you know, what kind of power were workers able to organize and wield in order to lift the conditions of those jobs. And for various reasons, some of them technology. An auto assembly plant is a huge investment that requires typically 1,000 workers to be at their place at the right time every morning before the assembly line can even turn on. And that happens to give workers quite a bit of power there. So they used that power over the decades, starting in the 1930s, to say, no, this is a tough job and we deserve to be paid better. It can be harder in other industries for workers to find that power, but there is power to be had. There are ways, for example, potentially pretty easy ways that you could bring the Uber system crashing down by arranging for a sufficient number of workers to log off the system at a given point in time. So even though it's organized around an individualized, seemingly powerless structure, if workers in the gig economy got organized, they could impose some pretty significant impact on the employers there in order to support their bargaining demands. So there are ways to organize and learn the lessons of auto workers in the past. And Unifor itself is trying to do that. Auto is just one small part of Unifor's total membership now. They're in all kinds of different industries. And the only thing in common is a philosophy that the economy will only give workers what workers are able to demand and win. And that means get organized.
Jim, this has been so interesting. You've given us so much to think about. We all come away from this knowing a lot more, having answers to questions and maybe even more questions, but certainly a sense of what's the pathway to a better tomorrow. Jim, thank you. And I want to add a plug for your center. The website, the work you do is so important and tremendous, and the website contains most, if not all of it. So I encourage everyone with us, check out the website of the Center for Future for, oh gosh, I'm going to bungle the name, the Center for,
Center for Future Work, yeah.
The Center for Future Work. And you'll find a lot of really rich, helpful resources there. I want to close on two fronts. One is, again, to thank Taylor Deasley for all her assistance and hosting today, and two other people in the Faculty of Arts who contributed a lot to make this session happen, Derek Reynolds and Melissa Wong. Thank you. And going forward, the Hub is planning more activities, and we are very much looking forward to shifting gears and putting a focus on educational programming around the rights of young workers, which include right to safe work, right to unionize, right to fair pay. We'll be having more of those sessions come up in the month of May. And with that, I'd be happy to hang in for a few more minutes. If anybody has suggestions that I could relay to the whole Hub of what you think would be helpful for us to be doing in an educational, in an outreach kind of way. But with all that said, Jim, this was superb. Thank you so much.